At first, the scene unfolds with a chilling stillness. A man stands bound tightly to a wooden post in an open courtyard, his arms pulled back and restrained so that escape is impossible. Around him, a circle of Roman soldiers forms with calculated precision, each one holding a drawn bow. The tension in the air is almost unbearable, thick, silent, and heavy with anticipation. No one speaks. No one needs to. Everyone present understands what is about to happen. This is not merely a punishment. It is a spectacle designed to instill fear. Then the command is given. In an instant, the silence shatters as arrows slice through the air, striking the man's body with brutal force. One pierces his shoulder, another his chest, others embed themselves into his back. The impact is relentless, methodical, final. Within moments, his body is covered with arrows, his strength collapsing under the assault. To any witness, the conclusion is obvious. No human being could survive such a fate. The soldiers, confident their task is complete, lower their weapons and walk away, leaving the lifeless form behind. And yet, this is where the story refuses to follow expectation. What appears to be an unquestionable death is, in fact, not the end. Against all logic, against all certainty, the man does not die. That man is Saint Sebastian, a figure whose story has endured for centuries not because of how he died, but because of how he lived, and, more astonishingly, how he survived. At the time, Sebastian was not an outcast or a rebel in the conventional sense. He was a soldier of the Roman Empire, serving during a period when loyalty to the state was not merely expected, but demanded without question. As a member of the imperial military, he occupied a position of stability and trust. Roman soldiers were more than warriors. They were enforcers of order, symbols of discipline, and instruments of imperial authority. To wear the armor of Rome was to embody its power. Sebastian, by all accounts, fulfilled this role with distinction. He was respected among his peers, trusted by his superiors, and firmly embedded within the structure of one of the most formidable empires in history. Yet beneath the surface of this disciplined exterior lay a secret that placed him in profound danger. Sebastian was a Christian. In the context of the Roman Empire, particularly during periods of instability and suspicion, this was no trivial matter. Christianity was not simply viewed as a different religious belief. It was often interpreted as a refusal to participate in the shared spiritual and civic life that bound Roman society together. To reject the traditional gods of Rome was, in the eyes of many, to reject Rome itself. This perception was especially dangerous for someone within the military. A soldier's identity was inseparable from loyalty to the emperor, to the laws of the empire, and to its religious traditions. For Sebastian to hold a private allegiance to a faith that stood outside, and at times in opposition to, these expectations created a silent but severe conflict. He understood the risks. This was not a naive commitment made in ignorance of consequences. On the contrary, Sebastian concealed his faith carefully, navigating a precarious existence between two worlds. Outwardly, he remained the model soldier, disciplined, obedient, reliable. Inwardly, however, he held fast to a belief that could cost him everything. This duality defined his life. It required constant vigilance, an awareness that exposure could come at any moment, and that such exposure would not be met with understanding, but with judgment and punishment. The Roman authorities, particularly during times associated with the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, were deeply wary of Christians, seeing them as potential sources of instability within an already fragile system. What makes Sebastian's story particularly compelling is not only that he possessed this hidden faith, but that he did not allow it to remain passive. According to long-standing traditions, he used his position within the military to offer quiet support to other Christians who were suffering under persecution. He is said to have visited prisoners, encouraged those awaiting trial or execution, and strengthened the resolve of individuals facing unimaginable fear. These were not acts of defiance in the open sense, but they were far from insignificant. In a system where association with condemned individuals could itself be interpreted as guilt, such actions carried immense risk. Each visit, each word of encouragement brought him closer to discovery. This tension between visibility and concealment, between duty and conviction, forms the core of Sebastian's identity. He was not simply a believer in a hostile environment. He was a participant within the very system that sought to suppress that belief. This contradiction made his position uniquely dangerous. It also made his eventual exposure almost inevitable. Secrets of this magnitude rarely remain hidden indefinitely, especially in a climate defined by suspicion and control. And so, the man bound to the post, pierced by arrows and left for dead, is not merely a victim of brutality. He is the culmination of a deeper conflict, one that had been building long before the moment of execution. The arrows themselves are only the visible expression of a far more complex struggle, a struggle between authority and conscience, between imposed loyalty and personal truth. What astonishes is not only that Sebastian survives the physical violence inflicted upon him, but that his survival forces a re-examination of everything that came before. If death was meant to silence him, then his continued existence transforms the narrative entirely. It raises an unsettling question that lingers beyond the scene itself. What kind of conviction allows a man not only to face such a fate, but to endure it? And what happens when that conviction cannot be destroyed? To understand why Sebastian's story unfolds with such intensity, it is necessary to step back and examine the broader historical forces shaping his world. The Roman Empire in the 3rd century was not the unshakable power it once appeared to be. Beneath its vast territorial control lay deep fractures, political instability, military pressure along its borders, and internal uncertainty that threatened the cohesion of the state. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, often through violence, and the constant threat of invasion or rebellion created an atmosphere of unease. In such a climate, stability was not merely desired, it was essential for survival. Every institution, every symbol, and every tradition was expected to contribute to maintaining order. The empire could not afford ambiguity in loyalty. Within this fragile environment, religion played a far more significant role than modern assumptions might suggest. The worship of the traditional Roman gods was not simply a matter of personal belief. It was deeply intertwined with civic duty and political allegiance. Public rituals, sacrifices, and ceremonies were seen as acts that upheld the favor of the gods and, by extension, the security of the empire itself. To participate in these practices was to affirm one's place within the Roman system. Conversely, to refuse them was not interpreted as a private spiritual choice, but as a disruption of the collective order. Religious conformity functioned as a visible and enforceable expression of loyalty. It is within this framework that Christians became increasingly suspect. Their refusal to worship the Roman gods or participate in state rituals set them apart in a way that was difficult for Roman authorities to tolerate. They were not merely different, they were perceived as dangerous. Their gatherings were often private, their beliefs not fully understood by outsiders, and their allegiance directed toward a single, invisible god rather than the pantheon that symbolized Roman identity. In times of crisis, such differences became magnified. Christians were sometimes blamed for misfortunes, accused of undermining social cohesion, or seen as potential catalysts for unrest. During periods associated with the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, these suspicions translated into concrete actions, arrests, interrogations, and demands for public renunciation of faith. For an ordinary citizen, being identified as a Christian was already dangerous. For a soldier within the Roman military, the implications were even more severe. The army was the backbone of imperial power, and its members were expected to embody absolute loyalty. There was little room for divided allegiance. A soldier who adhered to a belief system viewed as incompatible with state religion risked being seen not only as disobedient, but as a traitor operating from within. This is the tension that defined Sebastian's existence. His position placed him at the very center of Roman authority, while his faith aligned him with a group that authority sought to control. Despite this risk, Sebastian did not retreat into passive secrecy. According to long-standing traditions, his faith expressed itself through deliberate, compassionate action. He became a quiet presence among those who suffered under persecution, using his access and status to move in spaces where others could not. When Christians were arrested and imprisoned, awaiting trial or execution, Sebastian is said to have visited them in secret. These were not casual visits. The individuals he encountered were often facing the most terrifying moments of their lives, uncertain of their fate, isolated from their communities, and under immense pressure to renounce their beliefs. In such circumstances, encouragement carried extraordinary weight. Sebastian's role was not that of a public leader or preacher, but of a supporter who strengthened others at the point of collapse. He reminded them of the meaning behind their suffering, reinforcing the idea that their faith was not in vain. For those standing on the threshold of death, such reassurance could transform fear into resolve. He also provided practical support where possible, ensuring that prisoners were not entirely abandoned. These acts, though quiet and largely unseen, represented a form of resistance, not through confrontation, but through solidarity. However, the very nature of these actions made them inherently dangerous. In a system that equated association with guilt, aiding imprisoned Christians could easily be interpreted as complicity. Sebastian was not merely maintaining a private belief. He was actively engaging with individuals deemed enemies of the state. Each act of support increased the likelihood that his secret would be exposed. The line he walked was extraordinarily thin, between service and subversion, between loyalty and perceived betrayal. From the perspective of Roman authorities, his behavior, if discovered, would not be viewed with nuance. It would be reduced to a single conclusion. He had chosen allegiance to a forbidden faith over allegiance to the empire. Inevitably, the concealment could not last forever. In an environment defined by surveillance, suspicion, and the constant need to enforce conformity, secrets of this magnitude were unlikely to remain hidden. At some point, whether through accusation, observation, or coincidence, Sebastian's identity as a Christian was revealed. The moment of exposure marked a decisive turning point. What had once been an internal conflict became a public reality, subject to judgment and consequence. The response from authorities was swift and uncompromising. Sebastian was arrested, stripped of the protection his position once afforded him, and brought before those empowered to determine his fate. The transition was abrupt, from trusted soldier to accused dissident. In the Roman system, particularly during periods of heightened persecution, such proceedings were rarely prolonged or lenient. The objective was not only to punish, but to enforce compliance and deter others. Trials involving Christians often revolved around a single stark choice. Sebastian was confronted with that choice. He could renounce his faith, publicly affirm loyalty to the Roman gods and thereby restore his standing, or he could persist in his belief and face the consequences. This was not merely a legal decision, it was an existential one. To renounce would mean survival, a return to status, and the preservation of life. To refuse would mean suffering, humiliation, and likely death. The system was designed to make the first option as appealing as possible, and the second as terrifying as imaginable. Yet Sebastian's response did not align with the expectations of the system. He refused to abandon his faith. This refusal was not impulsive, it was the culmination of everything that had defined his actions up to that point. The same conviction that had led him to support others in secret now compelled him to stand firm in the open. In that moment, the internal tension that had characterized his life was resolved, not by compromise, but by clarity. He chose belief over survival, conviction over security. From the perspective of the authorities, this decision eliminated any ambiguity. A soldier who refused to conform under direct command could not be tolerated. The consequence was inevitable. The machinery of punishment, already prepared for such outcomes, moved forward without hesitation. What followed, the sentence, the execution, and the apparent finality of his fate, would seem to confirm the power of the empire to enforce its will. And yet, as the earlier scene revealed, even that apparent finality would not unfold as expected. The sentence, once pronounced, moved quickly from decree to execution. There was no prolonged delay, no reconsideration, no space for reversal. Sebastian, now stripped of rank and protection, was led to the place prepared for his punishment. The intent behind the method chosen was unmistakable. This would not be a quiet death, but a visible demonstration of consequence. He was brought into an open area where the act could be witnessed, where the message would extend beyond the individual to all who might harbor similar beliefs. There, he was bound to a wooden post, his body positioned in such a way that he could neither defend himself nor collapse to avoid the blows. His arms were pulled back and secured tightly, forcing his chest forward, exposed, vulnerable, and immobile. In front of him stood the executioners, Roman archers, disciplined and precise, their bows already drawn. This was not chaos, it was procedure. Each soldier understood his role, each movement calibrated to ensure the outcome was definitive. For a brief moment, there was stillness, a silence that carried more weight than noise. Then, at the signal, the arrows were released. They cut through the air in rapid succession, striking Sebastian with calculated force. One embedded itself in his shoulder, another pierced his torso, others followed, each impact compounding the violence of the last. The assault was not a single blow, but a sustained act designed to overwhelm the body's capacity to endure. As the arrows accumulated, his body became a testament to the brutality of the sentence. Blood marked the points of entry, his strength visibly failing under the relentless barrage. To any observer, the conclusion would have been immediate and unquestioned. No person, subjected to such a method of execution, could reasonably be expected to survive. The archers, having fulfilled their task, lowered their weapons. There was no need for verification beyond what was already evident. The man before them appeared lifeless, his body suspended and pierced, the outcome aligned with the intention of the sentence. With that assumption, they departed, leaving him where he hung, abandoned, exposed, and presumed dead. It is at this juncture that the narrative diverges sharply from expectation. What should have been an ending becomes an interval. The site of execution, once active with violence, falls into silence. Time passes. The body remains, unmoving, bearing the visible marks of fatal injury. And yet, according to the traditions that have preserved this account, the finality of death had not actually been achieved. Beneath the surface of what appeared to be a completed execution, life persisted, fragile, diminished, but not extinguished. The discovery of this fact did not come from the authorities or the soldiers who had carried out the sentence. It came from an unexpected figure, a woman named Irene, remembered in tradition as a compassionate follower of the same faith Sebastian had refused to renounce. Believing him to be dead, she approached the site with the intention of performing an act of care that, in that historical context, carried its own risks. To retrieve and bury the body of someone executed as a criminal, particularly a Christian during a period of persecution, was not a neutral act. It was an expression of solidarity, one that could invite suspicion or punishment. When Irene drew near and examined the body more closely, she encountered something entirely unforeseen. Sebastian was still alive. Despite the arrows that had pierced him, despite the blood loss and the abandonment, there remained a faint but undeniable presence of life. The discovery would have been as shocking as it was urgent. There was no time for hesitation. Recognizing the narrow margin between survival and death, Irene acted immediately. With the help of others, she arranged for Sebastian to be taken from the execution site and transported to a place where he could be cared for away from the scrutiny of authorities. What followed was not instantaneous recovery, but a gradual process of healing. The arrows had to be removed, the wounds treated, the body stabilized. In an era without advanced medical knowledge, such efforts relied on persistence, basic care, and, as the tradition suggests, a measure of providence. Over time, against all reasonable expectation, Sebastian regained strength. The man who had been left for dead began to recover, his body responding to treatment, his life reasserting itself where death had seemed certain. This phase of the story introduces an element that can be interpreted in multiple ways, whether as a miracle, an extraordinary instance of resilience, or a convergence of circumstance and care. But regardless of interpretation, its impact on the narrative is undeniable. Survival, however, is only part of what makes this moment significant. The more consequential development lies in what Sebastian chooses to do once he recovers. At this point, the logical course of action would have been clear. He had escaped death once, narrowly and improbably. The system that condemned him had already demonstrated its capacity for violence. To disappear, to seek anonymity, to preserve the life that had been so unexpectedly spared, these would have been rational decisions, consistent with self-preservation. No one would have questioned such a choice. Yet Sebastian does not follow that path. Instead, he makes a decision that transforms survival into something far more consequential. He does not hide. He does not remain silent. He does not reinterpret his experience as a warning to withdraw. Rather, he returns, deliberately, consciously, toward the very structure that had sought to eliminate him. This decision marks a decisive shift in the narrative. Up to this point, his actions, though courageous, had been largely concealed, operating within the margins of secrecy. Now, the possibility of concealment no longer defines his approach. The conflict that had once been internal becomes openly external. This moment functions as the turning point of the entire story. It is not the execution itself, nor even the survival, that defines the trajectory of Sebastian's legacy. It is the choice made after survival. In analytical terms, this is the pivot from reaction to intention. Previously, Sebastian had responded to circumstances, supporting others quietly, enduring arrest, facing punishment. Now, he acts with full awareness of the consequences, choosing confrontation over avoidance. The decision reframes everything that came before. The arrows, the wounds, the recovery. These are no longer simply events. They become prelude to a deliberate act of defiance. What makes this turning point particularly striking is its clarity. There is no ambiguity in the options available to him, and no ambiguity in the path he selects. By returning, he effectively nullifies the deterrent purpose of his original sentence. The execution was meant to silence and discourage. His survival, followed by his reappearance, undermines that intention. It introduces a new dynamic, one in which the authority of the empire is challenged not through force, but through the refusal to be subdued. In this way, the narrative advances beyond the framework of persecution alone. It becomes a study in agency under constraint, in the capacity of an individual to redefine the meaning of events imposed upon them. Sebastian's body had been subjected to violence, his life nearly extinguished, yet the ultimate significance of those actions is determined not by the perpetrators, but by his response. By choosing not to disappear, he ensures that the story does not conclude with survival as an endpoint, but continues toward a confrontation that will carry even greater consequences. Having survived what should have been a definitive end, Sebastian's return was not an act of impulse but of intention. He re-entered a system that had already condemned him, fully aware that the consequences would be irreversible. This time, however, he did not move in secrecy. The quiet acts of encouragement that once defined his faith gave way to something far more visible. According to long-standing tradition, he placed himself in direct proximity to power and confronted it openly. He appeared before Diocletian, the emperor whose authority embodied the very structure that had ordered his death. This was not merely a personal appeal or a plea for mercy, it was a public denunciation. In that encounter, Sebastian is said to have spoken against the persecution of Christians, calling out the injustice and brutality inflicted upon those who refuse to abandon their beliefs. Such an act must be understood within its proper context. In the Roman imperial system, the emperor was not simply a political leader, he was the focal point of authority, the guarantor of order, and a figure whose decisions were rarely challenged, especially by those already condemned. To stand before him and criticize imperial policy was not only bold, it was profoundly dangerous. It represented a rejection of the expected hierarchy, a refusal to accept the limits imposed by power. What makes this moment particularly significant is that Sebastian had already experienced the consequences of defiance. He knew, in concrete terms, what the system was capable of. He had felt the force of its punishment, endured its attempt to erase him, and witnessed firsthand how final such judgments were intended to be. And yet, that knowledge did not lead to caution or restraint. Instead, it appears to have intensified his resolve. His confrontation with the emperor was not an act of desperation, but of clarity. The conflict that had once existed within him, between his role as a soldier and his identity as a believer, had already been resolved. There was no longer any attempt to reconcile the two. His allegiance was singular, and it was no longer hidden. From the perspective of the authorities, this second emergence could not be tolerated. If the first execution had been intended as a warning, then his survival and return threatened to undermine its effectiveness entirely. Allowing such defiance to stand would introduce uncertainty into a system that depended on predictability and control. The response, therefore, was immediate. Sebastian was arrested again, this time with no ambiguity regarding his status. He was no longer a soldier who had deviated, nor a prisoner who might be persuaded to comply. He was now a symbol of resistance, one that needed to be decisively extinguished. The second punishment differed from the first in both method and intent. There would be no repetition of a spectacle that had failed to achieve its objective. The authorities sought finality, not demonstration. According to tradition, Sebastian was subjected to severe physical abuse, beaten, tortured, and ultimately killed in a manner that ensured no possibility of survival. Unlike the earlier execution, there would be no abandonment, no assumption, no margin for uncertainty. The process was carried through to completion, eliminating any chance that the outcome could be reversed. In this second execution, the logic of the system reasserted itself. A challenge had been issued, and the system responded with decisive force. From a strictly political standpoint, the result was clear. The individual who had defied authority was removed. Order, at least on the surface, was restored. Yet when viewed through a broader historical lens, the outcome becomes far more complex. The death of Sebastian did not conclude his story in the way the authorities might have intended. Instead, it transformed it. This transformation reveals a deeper paradox embedded within the history of persecution. The mechanisms designed to suppress belief often produce the opposite effect. By imposing extreme consequences on individuals who refused to conform, the system inadvertently amplified the visibility of their convictions. The more severe the punishment, the more attention it drew to the reasons behind it. In the case of Sebastian, the attempt to eliminate his influence ultimately preserved it. His actions, particularly his return after surviving execution, introduced a narrative that could not easily be dismissed or forgotten. This paradox is not unique to a single individual, but Sebastian's story provides a particularly clear illustration of it. The empire sought to enforce uniformity through coercion, operating under the assumption that fear would deter dissent. In many cases, this approach achieved immediate compliance. However, it also generated a countercurrent, stories of individuals who accepted suffering rather than abandon their beliefs. These stories circulated, not through official channels, but through communities that found meaning in them. Over time, they contributed to a growing sense that the power of the empire, while formidable, was not absolute. The impact of such narratives extended beyond the individuals directly involved. They shaped perceptions, influenced attitudes, and, in some cases, encouraged others to adopt or maintain the very beliefs that persecution sought to eradicate. Sebastian's refusal to renounce his faith, even after experiencing the full extent of imperial punishment, raised a question that could not be easily answered by force alone. What gives a belief such strength that it persists under threat of death? For observers, whether sympathetic or skeptical, this question carried weight. In this sense, the significance of Sebastian's story lies not only in the events themselves, but in their interpretation. His life and death became part of a broader pattern in which acts of suppression contributed to the endurance and expansion of the very movements they targeted. The narrative of a soldier, once aligned with the empire, then executed by it, and ultimately remembered for his defiance, introduced a powerful contrast. It suggested that authority could command obedience, but not necessarily conviction. Over time, this dynamic played a role in the wider historical trajectory of Christianity within the Roman world. While persecution created periods of intense suffering, it also produced accounts that reinforced communal identity and resilience. Sebastian's story, preserved and retold across generations, became one such account. It did not rely on institutional power or official recognition. Its influence emerged from its capacity to convey a consistent message. That belief, when deeply held, could withstand even the most extreme forms of opposition. Thus, the final outcome of Sebastian's confrontation with the empire cannot be measured solely by his death. In immediate terms, the authorities achieved their objective. In longer terms, however, the narrative they sought to control escaped their grasp. It continued to circulate, to inspire, and to contribute to a broader historical movement that would eventually outlast the structures that once opposed it. In the centuries that followed his death, the story of Saint Sebastian did not fade into obscurity. Instead, it evolved into something far more enduring, a symbol that transcended the immediate circumstances of his life and entered the realm of collective memory. Among all the elements of his story, one image came to define him above all others: the figure of a man bound and pierced by arrows. This image, stark and unforgettable, has been reproduced across generations in art, literature, and religious tradition. It is not merely a depiction of suffering, it is a visual language that communicates something deeper. The arrows, which were intended to end his life, became markers of his resistance. They transformed from instruments of execution into symbols of a conviction that could not be extinguished. What gives this image its enduring power is the contrast it embodies. On one level, it represents vulnerability, a human body exposed, restrained, and subjected to violence. On another level, it represents strength, not the physical strength to resist force, but the internal strength to endure it without surrendering identity or belief. This duality is essential to understanding why Sebastian's legacy persists. He is not remembered because he overcame his attackers in a conventional sense. He is remembered because he did not yield to them in the way that mattered most. His body could be broken, but his conviction could not be compelled. Over time, this image came to symbolize three interrelated qualities: steadfastness, faith, and courage. Steadfastness, because Sebastian's commitment did not waver even when confronted with the certainty of death. Faith, because his actions were rooted in a belief that extended beyond immediate circumstances, a belief that gave meaning to his choices even when those choices led to suffering. And courage, because he acted with full awareness of the consequences. Courage, in this context, is not the absence of fear, but the decision to proceed despite it. These qualities are not abstract ideals imposed upon his story after the fact. They emerge directly from the sequence of decisions he made, particularly his choice to return after surviving execution. The symbolic power of Sebastian's story also lies in its accessibility. He was not a ruler, not a general commanding armies, not a philosopher shaping doctrine. He was, in structural terms, an ordinary individual operating within an extraordinary system. This aspect of his identity allows his story to function as a point of identification rather than distance. It suggests that the capacity for conviction is not limited to those in positions of authority or influence. It exists at the level of the individual, within the constraints of everyday roles and responsibilities. In this sense, his legacy is not confined to a specific historical or religious context. It extends into broader questions about how individuals respond to pressure, how they define loyalty, and how they act when confronted with a choice between conformity and conviction. As his story was transmitted across generations, it contributed to a larger pattern in which narratives of endurance under persecution became central to communal identity. These narratives did not simply recount events, they established frameworks for interpreting them. They provided models of behavior, points of reference for understanding suffering, and examples of how belief could be maintained under extreme conditions. Sebastian's image, bound, pierced, yet unbroken in spirit, became one such model. It encapsulated a message that could be communicated without words, that there are forms of strength that do not rely on power, and forms of victory that do not depend on survival. This leads directly to the broader conclusion that emerges from his story. History is often written in terms of empires, rulers, and large-scale events. It emphasizes the actions of those who command resources, direct armies, and shape policy. Yet narratives like Sebastian's reveal another dimension of history, one that operates at the level of individual decision. While emperors such as Diocletian exercised immense authority, their influence was not absolute. It could determine outcomes in the short term, but it could not fully control how those outcomes were interpreted, remembered, or transmitted. In this sense, history does not belong exclusively to those who hold power. It also belongs to those who respond to power in ways that redefine its meaning. Sebastian did not alter the policies of the empire, nor did he dismantle its structures. What he did was demonstrate that the reach of authority has limits, that it can compel action, but not necessarily belief. This distinction is subtle but significant. It shifts the focus from what power can enforce to what it cannot eradicate. The enduring relevance of this perspective lies in its applicability beyond the specific context of the Roman Empire. Across different periods and societies, individuals continue to encounter situations in which they must navigate competing demands, between external expectations and internal convictions, between safety and integrity. Sebastian's story does not provide a simple formula for resolving such conflicts, but it does offer a clear example of what it means to choose one path fully, without compromise. Ultimately, the final message that emerges from this narrative is both direct and demanding. Belief, if it is to be meaningful, must be capable of withstanding cost. A conviction that exists only in the absence of challenge remains untested. It is when that conviction encounters resistance, when it is pressured, questioned, or threatened, that its true nature becomes visible. In Sebastian's case, that visibility came at the highest possible price. His life became the measure of his belief, and his death the confirmation of it. And perhaps that is why his story continues to be told, not because it offers comfort, but because it poses a question that each generation must answer in its own way. What do we hold to be true, and what are we willing to risk for it? If this story has prompted you to reflect more deeply on those questions, consider following the channel to explore further narratives that examine the intersection of history, belief, and human resilience. By subscribing and staying connected, you ensure that these stories, often overlooked, yet profoundly revealing, continue to be shared, analyzed, and understood in new and meaningful ways.